Was it a conscious policy of the robbers to smash up the bones like this into small pieces?
Well, I don't think it was made consciously. They just wanted to rob the mummy. They were mummified persons. They just wanted to rob the mummy, and doing it, they just have broken it into pieces. They just tried to find everything. And of course it was not made only once, because, robbers re-entered the tomb in different periods.
So they kept going over these bones,
over
breaking
the bone,
them more and more.
At the floor.
Yes. How do you decide that this group of bones here, that lot there, just a handful, how can you decide that that represents one person?
Well, it's the character of the bone, Every person has very characteristic features, and I'm grouping together bones with the same features.
Over here in a shoebox with sand on the bottom, presumably to protect the bones,
That's right.
You've got part of a skull. It's not all there, and I noticed that the skull has been built up from dozens of small pieces.
That's right.
Whose skull was that?
Well, I think this is the most important finding from the historical point of view. It's a restored, very patiently restored skull of the maybe or most probably Queen Mut Nodjemet, the royal wife of Horemheb, Mut Nodjemet. According to all the knowledge which was gained during the excavation last season by Dr. Geoffrey Martin, it should be remains of this famous queen.
Now, there's not very much of her left. I suppose you've got about, half a skull there, haven't you?
Well, it's practically a whole brain case, but there are some pieces missing, so I couldn't put all together. I have the back part, the rear part of the skull, and the other parts are in small pieces. Small pieces. And of course I have also a postcranial skeleton of the queen.
Oh, so most of her bones?
Yes, most of her other bones. I found that she was something about 40 years old. I think this date of her death is very important from the historical point of view.
Why is that?
Because we have indications that at the time of her death she should be at least 35 years old. So this is very well in agreement with the historical facts. My 40 years with this 35, at least 35,
So you're beginning to support the documentary evidence.
That's right.
As to the time of her death.
Yeah. Secondly, if you look here on this on these remains of the lower jaw, you can see that the jaw is extremely gracile and low and deprived of all teeth. You can find only remains of teeth sockets. It means that this poor lady suffered a long time dental disease, serious dental disease, which led to the loss of all her teeth.
So at the age of 35 or 40, she was absolutely toothless with a shrunken jawbone, because this is very much smaller than it would be in a healthy person.
That's right. It's very similar to a lower jaw of a very old lady of about 70, 80, 90 years.
Now, is this significant in terms of what we know of the royal family?
Well, I think it's significant when we take it into consideration with the findings on the skull itself. In the bone of the brain case, I found that the thickness of the bone is almost twice as thick as it should be in a lady of that age.
And what does that suggest to you?
Well, this suggests that this person was suffering for a long time, most probably a severe anemia.
Anemia?
That's right. So there is a very big possibility that she was ill at least 10 years of her age.
How does history describe Horemheb's queen?
Yes, it's very interesting that starting from the year 4 or 5 of his reign, of Horemheb, her reign, we just have no documents about the queen. She just disappears from the evidence. And then, according to the finding of Dr. Jeffrey Martin, it's most probable that she died in the year 15 of the king. So you can see now there is a period of about 10 years without sufficient information about the queen. It is quite possible that these are these 10 years when she was so seriously ill.
So a toothless queen who was ill was not popular at court, and this is why she dropped out of history. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, that's possible. Or simply she didn't appear at the publicity, you know, she was at home. But what is most interesting is the finding that the cause of her death was most probably the childbirth. Among the remains, among the scattered remains of the queen, we found tiny pieces of bones of a fetus.
These bones here that you're picking up?
That's right. And what is very interesting, the skeleton of this fetus is almost entire, which would point most probably that it was still contained in the body of the queen when she died with it, you know. She was 40 years, you know. It's very curious that she, in spite of being ill, gave birth, or wanted to give birth to this child, maybe a future king or a future queen of Egypt. And you know that Horemheb didn't get any heir, any children.
There was no heir.
No, there is any indication in written sources that he would have a son or a daughter.
The heir that Horemheb so wanted was denied him. And now archaeology is providing important new evidence about the end of the 18th dynasty. Of course, there's much more work to be done on this. Horemheb's tomb, although entered and robbed throughout the ages, still holds a great deal of evidence for modern archaeologists.
Well, as we were excavating it, we found material at other periods. Inevitably, you don't just find material of the period of the tomb itself. We found quantities of pottery and other objects of the Christian period in Egypt and the upper levels. In fact, later on, we found that certain rooms in the tomb itself had been used as houses in the Christian period. Some of the rooms had been converted into little houses.
Really? Is this usual?
Well, it's not uncommon, and in this particular instance, the houses were almost certainly those of monks who had their main monastery just over here to the east of us. There's a very large monastery known as the Upper Jeremias Monastery. Very probably these rooms were associated with that building.
Somewhat creepy, though, isn't it, living in a tomb?
Well, it's the kind of thing that the anchorites did, people who separated themselves from the main community and lived in the tombs. There's plenty of evidence for that in the early days of Christianity in Egypt. Monks would secrete themselves in the ancient tombs, and we found in the very deep tomb shaft in the first courtyard here, 56 feet at the bottom, there's a small burial chamber, and that was certainly used by a Christian monk or anchorite in the maybe 5th or 6th century AD. There he lived in darkness and solitude, and I suppose his food was simply lowered over the edge of the pit to him from time to time.
Geoffrey Martin has a feeling that the monastery nearby probably used some of the masonry from Horemheb's tomb in its construction. Or like so many other missing reliefs, they may be in museums in Europe, because in the early 19th century, agents searching for antiquities were operating in this area of Saqqara. But the majority of the original reliefs are still there, and they're superb. They're so sharp and fresh-looking, perfectly preserved by the desert sand. You'd swear that an artist had completed them only yesterday. And it's the interpretation and recording of these reliefs that will keep scholars like Dr. Martin busy for many years. Walking through the inner courtyard, he and I stopped to admire a particularly fine example of the artist's skill of nearly 3,500 years ago.
In some ways, it's the most interesting scene in the whole tomb. It shows, you can see him towards the end of the wall, the tomb owner Horemheb, as commander-in-chief of the army, is standing, I think, probably on the battlefield, you know, after a campaign, and being paraded in front of him are rows of prisoners of war, people from Western Asia, from Palestine and Syria, and then groups of men from the countries south of Egypt. Those from Western Asia, I think, almost certainly are representatives of the city-states of Asia. the chieftains and their families being brought back into captivity.
There aren't many inscriptions, so how do you
Well, in
know
actual
that?
fact, there aren't any inscriptions at all. That is the most disappointing thing about this particular wall. The reliefs themselves are extraordinarily interesting, and the workmanship, as you can see, is really quite outstanding. Some of the best, I think, to have survived from ancient Egypt. But it may be that the relief is unfinished, because after all, this tomb was never used by the tomb owner, and in fact quite a lot of the decoration is unfinished. He simply abandoned it, you see. We don't actually see episodes in the fighting, but we see, as you'll note here, the prisoners being brought back, and as it were interviewed even, because there's a scene here, isn't there, where a group of scribes are recording.
Oh, yes.
We don't know what they're recording, but they must, I think, be recording the names of these prisoners and the city-states and countries from which they came.
What about this scene here?
Isn't that a curious one?
Yes, an Egyptian soldier seems to be thumping one of the prisoners in the jaw.
That's exactly what he's doing, and I think this is a unique scene in Egyptian art. It's very curious. In this tomb, which was the tomb, after all, of a great military commander, we see several instances of the maltreatment of prisoners. They're being knocked about. It's extremely fine workmanship, as you see, with every detail of the faces carefully drawn by the artist. It's in very bold relief too, quite a lot of paint preserved. Interestingly, the block which is missing above is in one of the museum collections. It's in Bologna in Italy, and it's been there since the 1830s.
So you've tracked that one down?
That's been tracked down, and I've copied it in facsimile, and so we know exactly what that scene looked like. We are missing, as you can see by looking around this tomb, almost all the upper course of reliefs and inscriptions.
The ones that were easy to find and easy to take out.
Exactly, the first ones that you'd find, you see, the first ones that you would have to take away if you were demolishing the structure. Who knows, in future years we may find quite a lot of these reliefs reused elsewhere in the adjacent tombs. It's quite possible.
If they can be identified by whoever is excavating.
Yes.
But this is a very long-term project.
Oh, it is, yes. I mean, it may take, who knows, anything up to a century to excavate this huge area.
And what about the pieces of relief that are lying in museums in various parts of the world?
Well, for most of these, we are able to get very good casts. And these will be brought to Egypt and put back in their original positions in the tomb. So quite a lot of these blank spaces which you see now in these two courtyards can be filled with the casts, which after all, with modern techniques, are as good as the originals. You can hardly distinguish them from the originals.
So this whole tomb complex is going to be preserved and will not fill up with sand again?
Certainly, yes. There's no risk of that.
After 3 years, fascinating work in first discovering the tomb and then excavating it, what are your feelings about the significance of what you found?
Well, I very much hope that it's going to open up a whole new field of study in Egyptology. We knew already quite a lot about the history of Egypt in the 18th dynasty, the 15th and 14th centuries BC, but almost all of our information, you know, was derived not from this particular part of Egypt, the north, but it was derived from the south, from the great religious capital at Thebes, where so many officials were buried, and where the great cult temples are, and where the kings and members of the royal family were buried. That's where most of our information comes up till now. But it's always puzzled me a little bit that so little has been found in this region, in the region of the actual capital itself. Memphis, after all, was the great administrative capital.
Which is just down the road from here.
Just over the way from here, isn't it? Only about 2 or 3 miles over towards the east. Saqqara is the great necropolis, or the great cemetery for ancient Memphis. Very puzzling why so little was derived from this area. But I very much hope that, that the discovery of the Tomb of Horemheb will, as it were, open up a whole new field of study. We shall eventually know, of course after many, many years' work, quite a lot more about the northern part of Egypt in the region of the capital city.